So thank you so much for having me here. It's my second time I've done one of these, and they're always fun, especially when beer's involved, so it helps immensely. As stated, yeah, I'm Paul Knowles. I'm the Assistant Director at the Museum of Northwest Colorado, which is located in downtown Craig. If you've never been, I highly suggest you make a trip out there at some point. We are a nationally recognized institution with one of the largest collections of cowboy paraphernalia and firearms in the West, actually in the U.S. So if you've never made the 40-minute trip, I make it every day from Steamboat, so it's very doable, and it's definitely worth checking out. So hopefully we'll see you out there if you haven't been before. A little bit about me before I start. I moved here a little over 21 years ago from Texas, I'll admit it. And I started off as the marketing director at Yampa Valley Bank for 9 years, and I was the marketing director at Prudential, which became Sotheby's, during my tenure for another 4.5 years. And then I took a 1.5-year sabbatical off just to kind of recalibrate everything I had going on. And in that time, I really just devoured local history and became just enthralled with the fact that we are in a location that I would say thankfully Hollywood never found, because the amount of history that's happened within Northwest Colorado is seriously mind-boggling, and a lot of it's just not reported. And the more I learned, the more I realized that I can't believe this is stuff I never learned in school even. So from that and from my travelings in that 1.5 years and wanderings and meeting around, I was eventually offered the assistant director position at the museum and accepted it just over 7 years ago and have never looked back. So it's been a wonderful experience, and I get to do things that, as I was telling Paul Bonfield earlier, I seriously get a paycheck, and I don't know why, because it's an amazing field. So I'm going to talk about Harry Tracy tonight. How many of you actually have heard of Harry Tracy before seeing this? So he's one of these outlaws that, to me personally, he should be the most famous outlaw. This guy, if an outlaw is measured off their ability to evade capture, to strike fear in the heart of anyone that ever meets them, to also be that enigma type person that people liked and yet he's murdering people, and then also the ability to not be restrained for too long. This guy could break jails like nobody's business. So he should be a guy that's just synonymous. When you hear outlaw, he should be one of the first people that pops in your head. And he's not, thankfully, because once again, there's really not a lot written about him. If you research him online, there's a lot of misinformation and just outright fabricated stuff, actually. So I've only tried this once before, and that is to try to sit here in 30-45 minutes to explain the exploits of Harry Tracy, and they're so numerous and they're so fantastical that this is really going to be a lot to cram in here, but I'm going to go for it. So if I start talking too fast, because I do tend to speak fast, because first of all I love the subject and also because I have a lot to get through, then please raise your hand and tell me you haven't heard a word I said. So I'm going to go ahead and set the stage. The year is 1898, and Routt County consists of today's Moffett and Routt counties combined. They didn't become split counties until 1911. So the size of this is immense. I mean, Delaware, Connecticut, and Rhode Island combined still is not as big as Routt County is at this time. That has a few obstacles, especially when the county seat at the time is in Hans Peak, which is in the far east side of the county, and the part of the county that probably needs the most law is actually in the far west of the county, and that's Browns Park. Browns Park, if you've never been, is a very special place to my heart. It's a great place back in the day to hide out. It's a great place today to hide out. It's located right near the border of Wyoming and Utah, so it's also a wonderful place to kind of just dip in and out and hide in canyons. And so it's just this, like I said, it's a magical place that so much history took place that I'm going to try not to go on too many tangents talking about other stuff that's happened there. But in February 1898, in Hans Peak, Sheriff Nyman, the sheriff of Routt County at the time, receives the arrest warrants for 2 men, a Pat Johnson and a John Bennett. And he gets them from a J.S. Hoy, who was the Justice of the Peace in Hans Peak, in Browns Park at the time. And it's for cattle rustling, so stealing cattle. And they were stealing cattle and selling them to the workers of the bromide charcoal kilns, which if you've ever been out in that area, there's a set of amazing beehive charcoal kilns that still exist. In fact, the museum owns them and the 5 acres just this side of Browns Park. They're 120 some odd years old and they still stand. But these men were stealing cattle from J.S. Hoy and actually selling them to the workers of the bromide kiln, which of course he did not take kindly to. So he had some arrest warrants issued for him. At the time, as stated, this is 175-mile wagon road miles, and this is winter, and this is not an easy trip. So Sheriff Nyman has to make the trip all the way through Steamboat and then through Craig, and in Craig he picks up his Deputy Sheriff Farnham, and they continue on to Browns Park. So this is a map of the area. When they start approaching, so it takes about a week trip. When they start approaching Browns Park, there are 3 men all of a sudden that appear in front of them on the road, and they appear to be coming from the location of Powder Springs. Powder Springs, by the way, is one of the main stops on what is known as the Outlaw Trail. Browns Park is also one of those, and this is kind of a whole area of land that the Outlaws would use back and forth to go hide out. And Powder Springs was definitely one of those big spots. The sheriff sees them in front of him and realizes, hey, here's some men that may know the Johnson and Bennett I'm looking for. As he speeds up, they speed up. As he gets closer, they get farther away, and they finally break trail, and they're fully loaded with gear, and they head up on Douglas Mountain, just this side of Gates Lador, if you know the area. Nyman is an amazing sheriff. There should be whole books written about this guy. He decides, instead of pursuing him, he's just going to continue on to the Bassett Ranch. The Bassett Ranch is pretty much the hub of Browns Park. It's located on the far east side. Back in that day, if you were traveling, it was kind of the etiquette to anybody traveling through. You would usually let them stay at your place, make food for them, and the Bassett Ranch was the main hub. The post office was there as well. So Nyman makes his way to the Bassett Ranch. As soon as he gets there, there's another man already waiting there for him to let him know that Pat Johnson is now wanted for murder. He murdered a young boy just the week before over the border in Wyoming. Nyman recognizes this is becoming a bigger issue. He thinks that maybe he had spotted some of the guys he wanted the day before. So he gathers a posse of about 8 men, and they set out the next morning to go find these 3 men they saw. They do find the trail for them. They follow up Douglas Mountain, and they obviously scare them because as soon as they get to this camp, smoldering fire, all their gear is there. Instead of pursuing them late in the evening, Nyman decides to take everything they have, all their food, their clothes, their horses, and head back to the Bassett Ranch, knowing in February they're not going to be very happy about what's happening. The next morning they take off again. They send 2 guys back behind them to make sure, in case these outlaws double back, that they'll be spotted. And they head up Douglas Mountain once again, and they do, towards that afternoon, run into another smoldering fire camp with the posse. Nyman does not like the situation. It's a very easy place to ambush, so Nyman advises, hey, let's get back out of here. We'll regroup tomorrow and find them again. However, one of the posse men is Valentine Hoy, who is the younger brother of J.S. Hoy, whose cattle was stolen, who was the justice of the peace. And he pleads that let's just keep going after these guys. He crosses through the camp. There's a split rock on the other side. As soon as he approaches it, a man comes out from behind the rock, which is Harry Tracy, and shoots him through the chest, and he dies immediately. Nyman starts backing off, realizing that he's in a bad situation. He doesn't quite know who is there, but he recognizes that he's got some serious men on his hands. And what he doesn't know at the time is that he has found Pat Johnson. He is with them, but he's also found Harry Tracy and David Lant. The October prior in 1897, Harry Tracy and David Lant were in the Utah State Penitentiary in Salt Lake, Utah. They were there for petty stuff, really. They robbed a couple stores for some clothing separately. They did not know each other until they actually got to prison. They were only there for a couple months, and they decided they didn't like it too much. So one day while they were out digging trenches, inexplicably Harry Tracy pulled up a revolver, put it in the guard's face, disarmed him, took his clothes, took his shotgun, and they've been on the run ever since. It appears what happened was they made their way through. So David Lant's actually from Utah, so he knew the area quite well. They made their way through Utah and made their way up to Powder Springs, which, as I said, was a major stop on the Outlaw Trail that not many lawmen would even approach to get into anyway. And it appears that that's where they met Johnson and Bennett, who are wanted for cattle rustling, and now Johnson, of course, is wanted for murder. The heat is pretty heavy in Wyoming, so they decide instead of staying up in Wyoming, they're going to book it back down through Browns Park, and that is when Nyman ran into him. Like I said, he doesn't know this yet, but he knows he's got some bad dudes in his hand. The next day, this would be the same day as Valentine Hoyle was being shot. The 2 men they left behind to make sure no one doubled back did see a guy right up below them stop and fire 3 shots up in the air. Ed Bassett was one of the men left behind, who is the younger brother of Ann and Josie Bassett of the Bassett Ranch. He recognized it as John Bennett. John Bennett is not a very well-liked guy in Browns Park, but he knows him well enough. He's been in the park for quite a while. He comes with a plan to go down and essentially tell John, hey, I'm looking for cattle, it's getting late. If you want, you can just join me back at the Bassett Ranch tonight. You'll have a warm meal and a place to stay. And since he obviously wasn't finding his cohorts, he joined him back to the Bassett Ranch. When he gets there, he does not realize that the sheriff and deputy sheriff, so Nyman and Farnham, are already there. And Bennett walks in and is arrested. I'm pulling an audible here. That's why I'm trying to figure out how I want to do this. We've acquired some amazing audio here in the last couple months that we didn't even know existed, but through a series of events it does. One of the people in the Bassett Ranch that was there at the time was Josie Bassett. If you guys are familiar with Browns Park, you would definitely know the Bassetts, Ann and Josie especially. Ann became known as the queen of the cattle rustlers. Josie's cabin still exists in Dinosaur National Monument. She's an amazing woman. I named my horse after her. She's just this larger-than-life person. But Josie is actually at the Bassett place when this occurs. I recently made a trip with my father to Montana through a connection I've been working for a lot of years, and it's Josie Bassett's great-granddaughter. She had everything of Josie's, all of her personal effects, and she donated it to the museum. In there was a transcript of an interview with Josie. It was from the National Park Service. So I spent 2.5 months trying to convince the Park Service to help me, which was not easy. And they were able to go in their archives and pull out the audio. And in there is the moment that Bennett arrives at the ranch that night, and Josie Bassett is there telling her story. So I'm going to add 6 minutes to this presentation because I have the audio here, and it's in her own words. You're going to be some of the first people ever to hear Josie Bassett's actual voice, which gives me chills even still talking about it. So I'm going to play this for you, and it's her describing Bennett showing up on the ranch and what's going on at the time. And I hope you can hear this. It's a little muddled, the audio isn't perfect, and I'm going to just hold the microphone up. So remember, this is Josie Bassett at the moment that Bennett is being led back to the ranch and showing up.
So he come there, come right in the house, and he always been in the habit of doing that. He was always the habit of being afraid of me. And I was making cookies in the kitchen, and he came in, and I took up some cookies, and I said, "Would you have a cookie, John?" "Oh, well," he said, "because I haven't had any dinner today." And the sheriff at that time had got there. Two sheriffs from Rock County, Charlie Nyman and Farnham. And they were in the bunkhouse resting. So, and he didn't know it, of course. And that made me more frightened than ever. I thought, he'll never be arrested. He's killed somebody. I'm sure he will. So he sat down at the table, his cookies, and Farnham came in. Bennett didn't know Farnham. Never seen him. Farnham had never seen Bennett. Farnham went over to the washstand and washed his hands. And Bennett finished his cookies, and Farnham went around by where he was, and he said, is your name John Bennett?" He says, "Yes, that's my name." Well, he said, "Stand up, will you?" And I quit baking cookies to listen, see what's going on. I was just scared. I couldn't hardly speak. I was so scared. And he didn't stand up. He hesitated. Farnham said, "I said stand up." Farnham was a very determined man, a good sheriff. He was a deputy too. And Bennett stood up and he said, "I'd like to have some papers I'd like to read to you." And Bennett reached over to take the papers, and Farnham says, "Oh no, not yet." Said, I'll handle these papers for you. So he read the warrant to him and arrested him, and he told him, he said, "Hold up your hands." And put them up high. And I thought, now, if he's got a picture, he'll kill Farnham. It's gun he sat down at the back door when he came in. So he held his hands up high, and Farnham arrested him and put the handcuffs on him. And he didn't make much fuss about it. He swore, made a lot of threats what he'd do when he got loose. And he was an impudent-looking man. So Farnham, my father came in about that time. My father was in the post office, and he come in, and Farnham said, "Dad," you said, "where can we put this man for safekeeping?" He said, I want a guardian while he's in my custody." Father said, "I don't know of any place better than the post office." He said, I'll turn it over to you. There's a fire, and there's lights, and there's water buckets, and everything you need. He said, take him right in there. So Farnham did, took him to the post office and had his handcuffs on and kept him in there and stood guard right over him, right there, all day and all night. And he carried on like a gray wolf. You never heard such terrible yells and screams and swearing and determines what he's going to do to everybody in Browns Park. He said, "Old Bassett's the only white man in Browns Park." That was my father. I thought.
So I'll finish the second half of this, but I'll let you know what happened so you can relay what she's exactly saying next. What happened was, so the next day, the posse took off again, a much larger posse now that Valentine Hoy had been murdered. However, Farnham was left behind in the post office to guard Bennett and make sure that everything was okay. Around noon that next day, a group of men showed up from the park with garments basically on their head to mask themselves. They went in, they put a gun on Farnham, Deputy Sheriff Farnham, disarmed him, made him take the cuffs off of Bennett. They handcuffed Farnham. They went outside, they tied a rope over the gate, and they hung Bennett. They came back and told Farnham, they uncuffed Farnham and said, you know, don't come out for 30 minutes, we're out of here, and they took off. Farnham came out, saw that Bennett was hung, and then carried him to the back of the property and buried him. Which, by the way, this would be appropriate for this. That grave still exists. That is the grave of Bennett on the backside of the Bassett property. It's still there today in Browns Park. So she's going to describe that instance the next day. So that's what you're about to hear here.
Oh, no, that's a pretty way. We could hear him from the kitchen. He'd carry it on that way. So the next morning, about 10 o'clock, these men came that hung him. There was 8 of them. They were citizens in the park, every one of them. I knew every one of them. I didn't with those awful masks on. They had their masks, and I had one of those masks. I wish I'd kept it. It was the sleeve out of an old slicker, pulled down with eye holes in, great big tall sleeve. I had it a long time. I don't know what I'd done with it. I wish I'd kept it. They took him out, and I said, they didn't make any noise at all going in there. But somehow I heard a door shut or something. I was right on my tiptoes anyhow. And I said, "Oh, Dad, they're going to turn him loose. They're going to take him out and turn him loose." My father said, "Now you stay in the house. That's not for you to see." Father didn't know what it's going to do, but he knew by those masked men that something was going to happen. So they took him out and took him right down to the gate post and hung him. And wasn't I relieved? I thought that's the happiest hour I ever spent on this ranch. We won't be killed by John Bennett anyway. They all upstairs and then they all had dinner. Peace. It was very peaceful.
That still gives me chills. So that's what happened to Bennett, and like I said, there's his grave. Over the next few days, the posse had really a tough time tracking down these 3 men, even though they had no supplies. They did end up finding an old sheep camp, and they were able to get some supplies, but they were making their way back to Powder Springs, and eventually the posse kept up with, caught up with them, was able to arrest them. They brought them back to the Bassett Ranch. And then there was an inquest held inside the Bassett Ranch. Josie talks about that as well. And then what happens at that moment, here's the actual article from the Steamboat pilot of them being captured finally. Johnson is given over to the sheriff of Wyoming since he's wanted for murder, and then the 2 outlaws of Tracy and Lant are taken by Nyman to now make the long, arduous trip back to Hans Peak. He had to take a lot of back roads. He wasn't sure who these guys were, or if they had a gang that may have tried to liberate them along the way. But thankfully, they did make their way through Craig, Colorado. They stayed the night in a hotel there, which coincidentally, I just realized that Josie owned this hotel a few years later. It's where, if you know Craig at all, where Kramer's Flooring is when you first come in, right next to the theater. That's where this hotel was. There was a photographer waiting for him the next morning when they came out to start their journey to Hans Peak, and he took these photos, and thank goodness he did, because you can't look more outlawry than Harry Tracy in that photo. It's just an absolutely amazing photo. It's the only photo of Harry Tracy that's on a mugshot, and there's a couple photos of him when he was a kid, but yeah, he rehearsed that somewhere. And you can see his leg irons that he has on as well. David Lant has those as well. We're pretty sure we know the originals of these are, so we're actually in the process of trying to acquire these photos. So Nyman makes his way back to Hans Peak. He gets him in the jail. There is a jail cell up at Hans Peak. If you've ever been to the museum, it's called the Bear Cage. It is the actual jail cell that Harry Tracy and David Lant were in. You can go see it today. Unfortunately, it's also, they found a way within 2 weeks how to escape from it. It was a pretty ingenious way they figured it out. But without going into details of how they did it, which it took me a while to figure it out, but I've gone and looked at the prison or the jail, and you can see how it actually happened. But Nyman thought that he had both jail cells shut. One was not. And so when he comes in with their dinner, Lant comes out and just pummels him and it actually beats him unconscious. He then lets Tracy out. They take Nyman, put him in the jail cell where Tracy was, and Tracy decides to take his turn on him as well. Unfortunately or fortunately, Nyman actually did regain consciousness, but faked unconsciousness the rest of the time they were there. Tracy kept putting his ear on his chest, even hearing his heart saying, "This guy's up. Can we just kill him? Can you just let me kill him?" And it's pretty obvious Lant didn't realize the kind of guy Tracy was until the Valentine Boy incident, and he convinced him over and over, "We do not need to kill this guy. Let him go, Harry. This is not a big deal." But because of that too, Nyman got to hear their entire plan. And the plan was to leave Hans Peak, come through Steamboat Springs, get on the stagecoach, and head south to Walcott. Walcott was the closest train station at the time, so that the railroad ran up and down where 70 is today. So come nightfall, Tracy and Lant actually escape. They steal 2 stage horses and they start heading south to Steamboat. Nyman gives him a little head start to get him out of there. Then he starts making a ton of noise until someone wakes up and lets him out as well, and he's hot on their trail. Nyman arrives in Steamboat early the next morning, just in time to actually catch the stage. He sends some men out in different directions, but he himself gets on the stage because he feels like that's what's going to happen. One of the first stops they get to is Sydney, which is where Sydney Peak Ranch is today. And sure enough, one of the houses, the Larimore Ranch, 2 men come out and start trying to board it's actually a sled at the time since it was winter. And instead they meet a shotgun pointing right at him from Sheriff Nyman, and he rearrests him. Tracy simply said to him, "Hello, Sheriff Nyman, I thought you would just be waking up about now." Nyman realizes that he's not going to be able to keep these guys in Hans Peak. It's just not secure enough, so he sends them to Aspen, Colorado, which has a much more secure jail, a brand new jail that cannot be broken out of, until 2 months later when they escaped. And they did exactly the same thing they did here. They devised a way to make it look like they were locked in their cell, and they were not. A week later, Breckenridge receives its first armed robbery ever, and a week later another one happened in a different saloon. And there were 2 men that matched David Lant and Harry Tracy's description. And then at that point, Harry Tracy disappears from history. No one really knows what happened to him. This is one of my side projects, trying to figure this out. There's a grave I'm trying to dig up, which is not as easy as you would think, to get permission to dig up a grave, but there is a grave out in Rangeley, Colorado, that a lot of people, old timers, would say is David Lant. I can say I feel pretty confident that it's not David Lant, but it is another outlaw that escaped from Wyoming. And so trying to track that down is pretty tough. One other side note there as well, there is a letter that was written to David Lant while he was in Hans Peak that Sheriff Nyman received, but they had already escaped at that time, and he did not feel like it was his duty to send it on to Aspen. And it was from David Lant's girlfriend. This letter, by the way, is in the Tread of Pioneers archives. It's absolutely amazing. And in it she says, "David, I miss you so much. I hear you're in trouble. I cannot wait for you to see your little boy. He's amazing. He smiled. Just amazing." Nobody knew that David Lant had a kid until this letter. And through it, I was able to track down the actual who that was, who the kid was, and I actually was able to talk to the family last year. And they also said that nobody knew. And there was a book written about Harry Tracy in the 1990s. And they said that book is what revealed it to them. No one knew that their grandfather was the son of Harry Tracy or of David Lant. So there's DNA, is what I'm getting at. From here, like I said, Lance out of the picture forever. Tracy makes his way up to Billings, Montana. In Billings, Montana, one night he walks into a saloon. There's no one in the saloon except for the saloon keeper. He robs the saloon and robs the saloon keeper of his gold watch. The next day he tries to hawk the gold watch. A guy recognizes the gold watch as the saloon keeper and purchases it from Harry Tracy, goes back to the saloon, gives it to the saloon keeper. Unfortunately, the guy who did this had a shady past himself, and he was arrested for the actual burglary and sent to the state pen. Also while in Montana, Harry Tracy meets David Merrill. David Merrill had recently been released from the Montana State Pen and was equally as crazy as Harry Tracy, so they made a great couple. He was also from the Pacific Northwest, from Oregon, Washington, so they headed to Oregon and Washington, and the string of burglaries is just mind-blowing. They're extremely brazen. It didn't matter what it was, a butcher, a saloon. They disarmed and robbed a constable in broad daylight, so they just had no fear whatsoever. Unfortunately, David Merrill decided to drunk brag about it one night, and the cops were able to catch up with him and arrested David Merrill in the house they were staying. While there, David Merrill said, "Hey, Harry Tracy's not here, but he'll be back tomorrow." He told the truth. Sure enough, Harry Tracy showed up the next day. He didn't like what he was seeing, something fell off. A guy came to talk to him who was undercover. Harry Tracy saw right through it. He jumps on a trolley and a firefight ensues. Everybody misses except for one guy who happened to be a butcher that was robbed by Harry Tracy a couple weeks earlier. His son comes out and shoots Harry Tracy literally in the head, and then Harry Tracy's dead, and that's it. I'm totally kidding, there's 8 more murders coming. So they capture Harry Tracy. Their letter is sent, which this letter is actually in the Shred of Pioneers as well. There is a letter sent from Portland to Sheriff Nyman saying, "Hey, I think we have a guy that you're looking for. However, he's all bandaged up right now. He was shot in the head. Can you send us a picture?" Nyman obliged, and sure enough, it was Harry Tracy, so they have him. While he is there, J.S. Hoy, the Justice of the Peace out of Browns Park, who had the initial arrest warrants for him, sent a letter to Portland that just said, "Chain him to an anvil and treat him as he does others. When you people are done with him, if he is above the ground, we want him here." Remember, his younger brother had also been murdered by Harry Tracy. Awaiting trial, there's a recurring theme with Harry Tracy, and that is nobody's really sure how he pulled a lot of this stuff off. Somehow he got a gun smuggled into him, and on his way to the actual trial, he was able to pull out a gun, put it in the gut of the guard, and tell the guard to open up all the jail cells, let everybody out. The guard refused, a scuffle ensued, another guard showed up, a big firefight ensued. Tracy accidentally dropped his gun, they got it, and then they took him to trial. Ornery as ever in the trial, the case before him, he tried to take credit for it, even though it was definitely not him. He was just saying, "Yeah, I did that one too." But because he just tried to escape, he ended up with 20 years, and then Merrill ended up with 13 years. He was then sent to prison the next day, exactly 1 year from the date that he escaped Hans Peak. There was then in an Oregon paper, this was stated in one of the articles, it said, "The prediction is made that before Tracy is in the penitentiary 5 years, he will be shot to death by a guard for attempting escape, or he will commit murder to regain his liberty." There's some serious foreshadowing in there, by the way. 1 month later, so Tracy is, when I say enigma, he really is. He's about to meet a lot of people over his next few years. Everyone that meets him likes him. He's actually a nice guy. Yeah, they're a little scared when he comes in and points a gun in their face and demands food, but outside of that, they said he actually enjoyed his company. He was a big talker, very sweet. He decided 1 month after being in the Oregon State Pen to send a letter to Billings, Montana, describing the full burglary of the saloon in so much detail that the governor had no choice but to let the man off with the gold watch, because obviously he did not commit the crime. Tracy didn't need to do that. There was no reason to, but he felt that he had to at least let that guy off. So like I said, he's a hard guy to figure out. After about 2.5 years in the Oregon State Pen, Tracy and Merrill decide that they also don't like it there. And they are able to get a couple guns and some ammunition smuggled into the Oregon State Pen. Pretty sure that it was an inmate that was in there that had just been released a few weeks beforehand. I don't know how he convinced him, but the inmate knew the ins and outs of the prison and brought in a couple guns. So one morning they walked in, and instead of picking up their tools at the foundry for work, they picked up 2 Winchester rifles, Harry Tracy immediately murdered one of the guards point blank, then walked to a window, made one of these impossible 150-yard shots to a guard tower, and killed another guard. Came back with Merrill, grabbed a ladder, and straight up out of a Hollywood movie, walked into the yard. Bullets raining down on them. They're firing up. They were able to put the ladder up and literally escape the prison that way. Not being dumb, they then waited for some guards to come. 2 guards then followed them. They grabbed them, disarmed them, and then used them as human shields as they backed up across this 100-yard field to get to the forest. In the process, another guard does get shot to the chest. It's attributed to Harry Tracy. I would say it's very likely it was friendly fire. But then the other guard saw this and then also pretended like he got shot and fell down, and they just left him and ran. So if you're ever in that situation, do that. That works. It's worked multiple times with Harry Tracy, actually. Of course, right after this, there is the article regarding that escape. After this, of course, a huge posse is immediately formed. They were seen going south. They U-turned and went right back north. Usually what would happen in this case is an outlaw would disappear. I mean, they could have easily traveled east, disappeared into the wilds, changed their name, joined a gang, whatever, but just disappeared. But they didn't. That night after their escape, they robbed a guy that was north of the prison. They demanded food, they took his horses. The next day, they actually ran into 2 possemen. They attacked them, stole their guns and their buggy, and they kept heading north. At which point, the sheriff of Portland said if these were ordinary convicts, they would not come to Portland, but they are not ordinary. And he was correct. They decided to go right through Portland. They made it through Portland pretty quietly. However, while there, Harry Tracy came across a newspaper article that he read stating how they were ever captured in Portland in the first place, and it was the fact that Merrill told them Tracy would be back the next day. Tracy wasn't too fond of hearing that information, which will come back to bite Merrill later. No one thought they'd ever make it into Washington. They'll definitely be caught by then. There are 250 men after them, including bloodhounds, and they easily cross over into Washington by holding up a ferry. So now when they reach Washington, they become national news. This is, every newspaper in the country is talking about what's going on here. These guys should not have made it as far as they had. They've got bloodhounds and a possemen after them. The army has now been involved. And they pretty much make themselves known every night because they're holding up someone to demand food and clothes. And so they know where they're headed. However, nobody ever catches up with these guys, to the point that they even questioned if the posse was in on it. And they even brought in a fresh batch of dogs, thinking these dogs are horrible. Like, how can they not capture these 2 stinky men going north? But so be it, they kept going. Late June in Napa Vine, Washington, some shots are heard, but it wasn't until July 14th that a body was found, and it was determined to be David Merrill's. Tracy later admitted that he killed David Merrill because he was pretty ticked about the fact that's why he got captured in the first place. Like every good outlaw story, there's a lot of conspiracies around it, and I am anti-conspiracies, but however, on this one, I do think there's a good chance it was not David Merrill. There's a lot of weird stuff that went around this, including the fact that the lady that found Merrill, the body was so decomposed at the time, ended up marrying Harry Tracy's brother later. And so there's just a lot of weird stuff around that as well. At this point, with David Merrill out of the picture, Tracy gets even more brazen, believe it or not. Now everywhere he goes, the first words out of his mouth when he meets someone is, "I am Tracy." He just lets them know right off the bat, "I'm Tracy," and they obviously oblige to whatever he would like at that point. He makes his way all the way up to Olympia, and there holds up another ferry and convinces him to take him to Seattle. It's a very long trip. Along the way, he talks about everything. I mean, like I said, this guy was an open book, and actually paid the man and told him his whole story, his life story about what he's done, what he plans on doing, everything. Because he knows he's Teflon and can't be touched. When he makes it to Seattle, you should see the articles from the day in Seattle. Seattle feels like the whole town is about to be murdered. He's now made his way into the largest population center in the Pacific Northwest, which, like I said, this is not expected. No one thinks that that's where he would end up. Of course, as soon as he gets there, there's reports everywhere of everybody that looks suspicious is now Harry Tracy. But finally, some good reports come in that they think they've seen Harry Tracy at an abandoned cabin up in Bothell. The posse arrives. It's a no-win situation for Harry Tracy. They approach the door. As they get close to the door, Harry Tracy pops up from behind a stump, takes 2 shots, and kills 2 posse men, then takes off and escapes. He then runs into a rancher, steals his buggy, kidnaps the rancher, and then heads back south to Woodland Park, which is right in the middle of heavily populated Seattle. He picks a house that he simply said looked cozy. And it was. There was an older lady named Mrs. Van Horn that lived there, and her neighbor was visiting at the time. He busted in with his kidnapped rancher, demanded dinner, and she loved him. She said he was a very sweet fellow and actually enjoyed having his company there. He even convinced her to write a letter to his mother saying that he's okay, and told her she's going to be really ticked off when she finds out what I've been doing. However, later in the evening, a delivery boy does show up at the door, and she mouths to him, "Harry Tracy's in here." Delivery boy goes and alerts the sheriff. The sheriff puts out a whole an order to the entire force that says, "Do not approach the house. I want to see where he's going. I want him out of this heavy populated area." We will then track him down. However, the reward at this time in today's dollars is probably a little over $100,000. So 2 of the deputies heard this and said, "Yeah, we're not waiting. We're going to get that reward." So the sheriff by himself sits out in a bush in front of the house, waiting for Harry Tracy to come out. Unbeknownst to him, 2 other deputies were on the other side of the yard, also hiding in bushes. Tracy does come out at one point. These 2 deputies stand up and tell Harry Tracy to raise his hands. Instead, he raises his Winchester rifle and takes 2 shots and kills both of them. So that's 4 people in one day, if you're counting, that he just murdered. From there, he then heads over to Puget Sound and finds a Japanese fisherman and convinces him to take him over to Bainbridge Island. When he gets to Bainbridge Island, he finds the house, a very secluded house of the Johnson family. He just obviously forces himself in there. Once again, they said he was an extremely nice fellow. He demanded new clothes. He said, "You might want to keep my clothes because you're probably going to wear something someday as a memento," which they obliged. And then they had a caretaker for him named Mr. Anderson. So Harry Tracy ties up the Johnson family, all of them, takes Mr. Anderson, and then steals the Johnson boat and takes off again. Mrs. Johnson works her way out in a couple hours and then puts out the alarm that that's where Harry Tracy is. So a huge posse is formed in Seattle and then sent by boat by way of Puget Sound over to Bainbridge Island. If they were looking a little more carefully, they would have seen Harry Tracy going right past them, right back into Seattle. Once it was then known that he was using the Puget Sound, the Navy was enlisted. This is the first time and probably only time ever that the Army, Navy was enlisted to track down one man. This is how big this became. And this is in addition to 300 men now chasing him and dogs, and they still are no closer. Mr. Anderson is with Harry Tracy for the next 4 days. He says he was treated very well except for being tied up at night so he wouldn't escape, but he was fed well. He got to hear, there's a lot of conversations that happened that he reported that, I don't know what I just did. Nailed it. And he said, yeah, he was extremely well taken care of. He liked Harry Tracy. He made his way over to Renton. And in Renton, there was a house full of women whose husbands were away, and Harry Tracy made his way into there and stayed there for quite a while. And they also liked him. He gave them more mementos for them to keep, and they happily did so. There he does leave Mr. Anderson behind. He chains him up and then puts him out in the field somewhere, and then takes off. While a posse was approaching, he runs into one of the posse and convinces the posse man that he is actually part of the posse as well, and walks right past him and takes off. He then heads to Kent, and in Kent he finds a family that he barges in their house, tells the husband that the husband needs to go and secure some firearms for him, so the husband takes off to go do that. In the meantime, he takes the family, keeps them hostage. When they were interviewed later, they said he was extremely nice to us. We didn't get to stay in the house because he kept them up on a hill because he was afraid of an ambush, but let them go as soon as the husband got back with guns and ammo. For the next 3 weeks, Harry Tracy disappears. No one really knows what happened to him, but suddenly he appears back. Is this anyone that knows? Is it Wenatchee or Wenatchee?
Wenatchee.
Wenatchee. That's where he then shows back up. So he has now crossed the Cascade Mountains. There's a report that he shows up on a horse with a very heavy beard when he shows back up. And there's even some reports that he made a phone call to the sheriff just to basically say, "You're no good at what you do." He then continues heading east, and he runs into a young boy by the last name of Goldfinch, and demands that Goldfinch sit down and have dinner with him. They have a very long, nice dinner. He then tells Goldfinch everything, and tells Goldfinch, "I want you to take me to a ranch house where I can now clean up and kind of regroup." And so he takes him to the Eddy Ranch. Along the way, Goldfinch even says that while they're going through any kind of pinch point, Harry Tracy would make sure that Harry was in front in case it was an ambush so the boy wouldn't be harmed. Like I said, he's a sweetheart. They get to the Eddy Ranch, and while at the Eddy Ranch, there's 2 brothers that have a lot of work to do. Harry Tracy stayed there for 3 days. He told Goldfinch that the only way he'll let him go is if he promises not to tell anyone. Goldfinch obliges for a few days at least. And at the Eddy Ranch, Harry Tracy, they loved him. I mean, he was helping fix their barn and do different farm work around. However, Goldfinch's conscience, I think he was 14, got the best of him, so he went to Creston, Washington, and there he he went to the telegraph station and put out a telegraph to the sheriff saying, I know where Harry Tracy is, and he's at the Eddy Ranch. Unfortunately, there was another man in the telegraph station that overheard this, went and grabbed 4 of his buddies, and they took off south to the Eddy Ranch so that they could try to collect on this huge reward. They get there, and they're up on a bluff trying to scout the situation. They see Harry Tracy. Harry Tracy sees them, so he ducks in the barn, grabs his pistol and his rifle and the ammo, and then takes off across the field. And he makes his way to this rock. This is now known as Tracy Rock. It still exists. This is a big hayfield at the time. Along the way to that rock, the posse starts shooting, and they finally do hit him in the leg. He falls down hard on his gun, on his Winchester. He makes it to the rock and fires from both sides of it all the way until nightfall. He didn't even get close to hitting the possum, which, as you know, is not like Harry Tracy. Obviously, when he fell, he knocked his sights off of his gun, and so he was just kind of throwing bullets in the air. As soon as nightfall hit, the rest of the major posse arrived and surrounded the field. Harry Tracy tried to crawl through it. Unfortunately, since it was a wheat field, they could see the stalks moving. Everybody was taking shots in there because everybody wanted to claim it was them that killed Harry Tracy for the reward money. And then around 10:30 that night, there was one last muffled shot that was heard. And at that point, everyone kind of suspected what had happened, but nobody had even remotely the courage to go in and find out what happened. And so the next morning, nobody volunteered. They finally picked 2 guys to actually draw straws. The guy who lost went in, and he did come across Harry Tracy, still holding his revolver in his hand with his Winchester rifle. And this is a pretty graphic photo. If you get close to it, he put his gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. So, and that was the end of Harry Tracy. So he goes down as really the last gunslinger of the West. He kind of was in that. This is 1902 when this occurred. He's this guy that, unfortunately, technology was ahead of them. So telegraphs and phones were already in the area, so they were able to at least find him. But even with that, it's absolutely astronomical the amount of times that he was able to escape no-win situations. And just to give you, when I say that I think this guy should be the most famous outlaw, I'm not alone in that. Because back in the day, the Seattle Times agreed with me. And they wrote this, this is 2 weeks before he committed suicide. In all the criminal lore of the country, there is no record equal to that of Harry Tracy for cold-blooded nerve, desperation, and thirst for crime. Jesse James, compared with Tracy, is a Sunday school teacher. A couple more things. If you look up here, there is a 45 Colt revolver. This is actually Harry Tracy's revolver that was taken off of him in Browns Park. We have the full gun rig as well, the leather gun belt with the bullets still in there. But it's a little more fragile, so I hesitate bringing that out. But this is actually Harry Tracy's firearm. Our museum, like I said, we go out and try to find artifacts before they go to much larger institutions. So we're always working on multiple angles at once, trying to get with these families before they go to Smithsonian or wherever else. And so this is one of those artifacts we're able to acquire. So definitely come up and take a peek at that, and then I'll open it up to any questions you have. Now, so he's attributed with 9. 3 of them are, well, for instance, the guard that was shot as a human shield. Like I said, there's pretty likely possibility that was friendly fire, but nobody, of course, would admit it at the time. Valentine Hoy is in question only because Harry Tracy claimed he didn't do it. However, everybody else said Harry Tracy did it. So he never went to trial, so we'll never know for sure. But you can pretty much say with confidence that it was Harry Tracy, and probably this gun. This revolver up here, by the way, Colt's really good at when you can track down serial numbers. You can see exactly when and where revolvers were shipped. And this is the firearm that he pulled up from the trench when he escaped. And if you look up where this went from the Colt factory, it did go to Salt Lake City in the 1890s. So everything checks out. I mean, and this firearm was with Deputy Sheriff Farnham's family. So it was his great grandson who had a really good year in the stock market and decided that he did not need the monetary value of this gun, so donated it over to the museum, and that's how he acquired. So there's even an article of the day when Mr. Farnham died that Mrs. Farnham owns the firearm that was taken off of Harry Tracy, and it describes this. So it's one of those, sometimes in a museum you kind of have to make a final leap that you have enough information. This one is one of those that you have no doubt about. So it's one of my favorite artifacts by far. Yes, sir.
Do you know how many people Jesse James killed?
I don't know Jesse James. I don't know my Jesse James history. But if you were to pick one outlaw that was probably the worst as far as murders, I think it would be hard to top John Wesley Hardin. That guy, that would be one guy I would say was more insane than Harry Tracy. One thing I will say about Harry Tracy, though, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, is that he did not have this bloodlust for just going out and murdering people. It was only people that were trying to capture him. That's it. So it wasn't like he was meeting these people and then murdering them and taking off. He was nice to them, and then yet, if you wanted to capture him, that's where you were going to have a problem with Harry Tracy. Sir?
What year was the recording of Josie?
That recording was in 1960. She died in 1963. This was taken just a few years before, and it was the National Park Service. It was a volunteer for the National Park Service that recognized that she was one of these figures of the Old West that probably should be recorded, and thankfully he did. It's frustrating as a historian because you hear it, there's so many questions you didn't ask. You're going, oh my gosh, why didn't you follow up on this question, because it would answer so much. When I talked about the acquisition we made that led to this, though, this last year, the great-granddaughter of Josie Bassett that I mentioned when I went up to Montana and got to meet with her, she donated a carload. So my dad has a Subaru Outback, and it was filled to the brim with Josie Bassett's personal items, including a long lock of her braided hair, her branding iron, all kinds of her personal items from her cabin. If you've ever been out to Dinosaur, like I said, the cabin's one of the main attractions in Dinosaur. But one of the coolest things in there was her personal copy of Charles Kelly's Outlaw Trail. The Outlaw Trail is kind of the Bible on outlaws of the day, especially Butch Cassidy, Sundance, that whole story. And to this day, people still recommend it as this is the book. There's even a chapter in there called Brown's Park, and there's a chapter called Ann Bassett, which is Josie's sister. Josie's personal copy, let's just say Josie was not a fan of Charles Kelly. Almost every single page, probably over 150 times, she writes, BS, I was there, that's not what happened. She talks about when Charles Kelly dies, he's gonna burn in hell because he's telling lies about dead men. And I mean, she really goes off. But it's one of these rare artifacts of a first-hand account of someone that knew Butch Cassidy well. It was long rumored that she actually dated Butch Cassidy. I don't know if there's any merit to that, but this is how much she was in connection with amazing moments of the day. And here's a whole book of her annotating, that's not what happened, I was there. She even mentions the inquest, because there was something Charles Kelly talked about the inquest when they caught Tracy and Lant, and she writes, BS, it was in my cabin. You're going, it sure was, and she was there. She was baking cookies, as you just heard her say. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Is her cabin still?
Yeah, so she homesteaded, I think 1913. She left Browns Park. She went through a few husbands, which was also not common for the day. And she had two sons as well. One of the sons lived in Jensen, Utah. She went and homesteaded, which is in 10-15 miles east of Jensen now, in Dinosaur National Monument. And she built two different cabins. Her third that she built, which is still very crude, still exists. You can still walk in it. Everything's still in there. We have some great photos of the inside of the cabin now as well. But yeah, that cabin's still there, and it was a beautiful spring that came out right there as well. There was a big pond. And what's great about meeting her great-granddaughter grew up in Jensen and knew Josie. Josie didn't die until she was 12 years old. So she has all these first-hand stories from Josie herself of things Josie said or did, or even her mannerisms. She also bootlegged. She had a still that she ran off a canyon when the cops were coming. So just really amazing stories. And yeah, I highly suggest you go out and see that cabin. It's there. And, you kind of get a feel for Josie. She refused. She didn't die till 63, and she refused to have running water or electricity or anything. She said, "What is wrong with actually working for everything you have on a daily basis?" And she was right. I mean, she lived an amazing life and did it right for sure. Anyone else?
Was he born and raised in Utah?
No. So Terry Tracy's actually in the Midwest. I think it was Ohio. To go back to my early Harry Tracy stuff, but he was a a son of a bunch of lumberjacks, really, to would put it. And his brother was actually considered the bad kid, and Harry Tracy was the good kid. That obviously flipped at one point. But, there's early stuff on Harry Tracy that's hard to track down. There's a lot of, like I said, actually getting into history, realizing how wrong the internet is really depressing, because so much stuff that when you really dig in, realizing it's just mostly wrong. I mean, I would say one of the biggest rumors about Harry Tracy, you look up anything about Harry Tracy, it's going to say that he was part of Butch Cassidy's gang. Harry Tracy wouldn't dare hang out with this guy. I mean, this guy is a psychopath, and Harry Tracy was a very methodical planner. So stuff like that is just prevalent out there, and it's just not true. So there's a lot of stuff about Harry Tracy being in the gold mines of Colorado, which there's just no evidence of any of this stuff, so you just have to kind of wipe it off altogether. He did spend some time in Washington before he made his way to Utah and got captured, though, so he did know the area somewhat as well.
I guess he never had any children.
He never had any children. No.
That we know of.
Right. But that tracking down Lance kid, like I said, that's kind of a game changer. Just because the lady that I talked to, which was his granddaughter, the kid's granddaughter, she sent me everything she had. It's all the genealogy, all the stuff she had done because she wanted to know more. And just having that connection now, knowing that there's still, what's great is that, like I said, the grave that I'm trying to dig up, which, like I said, it's way harder than you think. And no one knows who it is. It just says Dave Stillwell is the name of the grave out in Rangeley. But there's no descendants. No one knows this guy committed suicide in the 40s. I've also tracked down the guy that I actually think it is. He was an escapee from Wyoming. I tracked down his descendants as well. And so I've got two sides of DNA to figure out if we can ever get into that grave and find out exactly what it is. But I'm pretty sure it's not David Land. There's a lot of people that swear by it, though.
What do you think drove him to do this?
I wish I knew. I mean, he's a hard person to study just because you can't, it's hard to get in the mind of him. I think he just seriously had some mental issues, that he had no fear of consequences. I mean, the fact, like I say, he didn't disappear. The fact that he would just sit there and repeat, "I am Tracy," and basically daring cops to come after him, and knowing that, I mean, there's just something that has to be a little off for all that to happen, for sure. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.